Hi everybody, Professor Benelo here with a second short video on the first three topics you can choose for Unit 2 discussion board: the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuban Missile Crisis, and Vietnam War protests. Okay, so the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred in 1961, but you have to go back a couple years to the Cuban Revolution, the end of the Cuban Revolution, I should more accurately say, in 1959. 1959, the Cuban Revolution ended, bringing communist government of Fidel Castro to power in Havana. The plan for the Bay of Pigs invasion actually was formulated during Eisenhower's time in office, but it couldn't be completed while he was still in office. So John F. Kennedy inherited this. Basically, the CIA trained Cuban exiles in Guatemala to invade Cuba. And the whole hope was that Cuban citizens would rise up with the Cuban exiles to oust Fidel Castro from power. And the place that these force of exiles was landing was known as the Bay of Pigs. So in January of 1961, when John F. Kennedy became our 35th president, he inherited the Bay of Pigs from Eisenhower, which is key. April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion actually occurred. The U.S. government was to aid the exiles with 2 airstrikes. After the first airstrike, the involvement of the U.S. government became obvious, and Kennedy canceled the second airstrike. Still a move that's considered controversial today, and many in the Cuban American community are upset about it still to this day. About 1,200 exiles were taken prisoner and 100 were killed. President Kennedy negotiated the release of these imprisoned exiles. Excuse me. A year and a half later, in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. October 1962, U.S. military surveillance planes photographed nuclear missile sites being constructed by the Soviet Union within Cuba. The Kennedy administration had 2 options in regards to how to respond to this buildup of these missiles. Firstly, order an invasion of Cuba, which a year and a half after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, not really an option. Secondly, place a naval blockade against Cuba. Kennedy administration chose to place a naval blockade against Cuba because it was feared that another invasion would lead to intervention by the Soviet Union and things would really escalate. Negotiations during the Cuban Missile Crisis lasted a very tense 13 days. In fact, a great book is 13 Days by Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy was the president's brother. He served as his attorney general, and he was very much involved in the cabinet meetings regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the United States has ever been to nuclear war. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, again, wrote a book about his experience as a cabinet member during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's called 13 Days. It was also turned into a Hollywood movie. The Soviets removed the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. But what was not widely known until recent years was the fact that the U.S. agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey and Greece as part of the negotiations that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's funny because during the Cold War, which lasted until 1989, about 1989, 1991 approximately, students were always told in history class, oh, well, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we stared down the Soviets, darn it, and they blinked and they took away the missiles. Not exactly so. It was more of a even-Steven swap. But anyway, that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, the last topic I'm going to go over in this short video is the Vietnam War protests. Basically, background information on this: John Kerry gave the speech in front of Congress on April 23rd, 1971. At the time, Kerry was a returning Vietnam veteran, and he was very disillusioned at the war effort and wanted the U.S. to get out of Vietnam. John Kerry went on famously to serve as U.S. Senator from Massachusetts from 1985 until 2013. He was also the Democratic nominee for president in 2004. He ended up serving as Secretary of State under President Obama from 2013 until 2017. From 1966 to 1970, he served as a lieutenant in the United States Navy fighting in Vietnam. Kerry became very disillusioned with service in the war, leading him to join Vietnam Veterans Against the War. This group was formed in 1967 and basically was made up of Vietnam veterans who were now opposed to the war. Kerry was chosen to give this incredible speech in front of a congressional committee on behalf of the organization on April 23rd, 1971. So those are the first three topics that you can choose from, everybody. My third and final video will be discussing the last three topics. So I will see you in a bit.